In distant parts of the world, far from the transparency of Western governments, democratic societies, and the human rights we hold dearly, lie tyrannical leaders, dictatorships, and oppression. It can often be said that no citizens of the world have experienced the latter quite like North Korea. Behind the elaborate parades, convincing propaganda, and clear desire to serve a leader looked upon as God, lies a culture that appears to have severed itself from the collective human conscience and lives in a world most in the West would consider an earthly representation of hell. Join us as we embark on a grim voyage to one of the most secretive nations in the world and attempt to unweave the ghostly tales of unimaginable horror, deceit, and death. These are the stories of citizens living in constant fear, subjected to brutal punishments for the slightest infractions, and often disappearing without a trace. So, come along as we expose North Korea's appalling punishments and concentration camps. Over the past century, the Korean peninsula has undergone a drastic change, culminating with the official partition of the nation in 1948. During this period, history bore witness to the ascension of the Kim dynasty, inaugurated by Kim Il-sung. To some, he was a revolutionary and military leader. To others, he was the incarnation of a monster. Sung was responsible for founding the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, commonly known as North Korea, which he led as supreme leader from its establishment in 1948 until he died in 1994. Afterward, the reins of dictatorship were handed over to his son, Kim Jong-il, who is now at the nation's helm. Like the most oppressive nations in history, North Korea spends a considerable amount of manpower convincing their population that they live under the greatest regime ever to exist. Yet, this couldn't be farther from the truth. Over the past 70 years, whispers from this isolated nation suggest the government has engaged in an unprecedented number of human rights violations that rose from the birth of a nationalist regime. Families lived in fear as Sung's power grew. Those who spoke against his ideologies or the state were condemned to harsh punishments or, worse, death. For political prisoners and anyone dubbed enemies of the state, specific concentration camps were established so that they could serve their nation in other ways. The North Korean government maintains different systems of labor camps: the Kwanlee-so, or political prison camps, and the Kwo-hwa-so, or re-education labor camps, among other types of detention facilities. For many, once they enter into labor camps bound by chains and shackles, the despair will soon set in, as many are aware they will most likely never return home. One of the most terrifying and downright disturbing of these centers is the Kaeshan political prison camp, also known as Camp 14 to the outside world. The camp was established just in 1959, over a decade after Sung came into power, and is found just 40 miles north of the capital, Pyongyang. Hidden amongst the mountains from above, it sits on the north bank of the Taedong River. According to estimates from the U.S. Department of State, Camp 14 is approximately 60 square miles in area and is said to hold as many as 15,000 prisoners, all serving life sentences and subject to some of the most heinous living conditions on Earth. While it's almost unimaginable to think of the horrid conditions found within North Korea's concentration camps, we do know that Kaeshan, like most other prisons, is designed to segregate the enemies of the state and unredeemable individuals from the general population. This is done because they have committed political crimes. They are forced to work in back-breaking conditions through unending hard labor such as mining, farming, and even raising livestock to punish them for these varying offenses, whereas others work long hours in textile factories. An individual can earn a one-way ticket to such a horrendous place in many ways. State officials who have performed poorly in their jobs are often sent to the camps. The same life of confinement can be expected for anyone brave enough to criticize the regime and live to tell the tale, as well as those suspected of engaging in anti-government activities. However, a crime almost unbeknown to the Western world sees prisoners spend the entirety of their lives in prison without actually committing a crime. You see, under the North Korean regime, individuals can fall victim to the 3 generations of punishment, in which 3 generations of a prisoner's family are also sent to the camp and may die there without having committed a crime themselves. It's difficult to imagine the toll such a sentence would have on one's mental state of affairs, knowing you may never see the outside world simply because your grandfather committed a crime several decades ago. It highlights the dark and disturbing truth at the center of one of the world's most evil dictatorships. Western society would know very little about the darkness that lurks in North Korea if not for the hundreds of men and women who have defected to the South, risking their lives to do so. Some of these have even managed to escape and have helped shed light on the dark activities and horrid living conditions of the camp, some of which are darker than we could ever imagine. One story known around the world is that of Shin Dong-hyuk, who was allegedly born and raised inside the cold metal fences of Camp 14. Shin managed to escape the notorious Kaeshan camp when he was 23 years old. One evening, he eluded the careful watch of guards and slipped under part of an electrified fence, having to pass over the remains of a friend to escape. He later found his way to China and South Korea before eventually departing for the US. Being one of the only known people in the world to have been born inside a North Korean concentration camp, Shin's story was highly sought after. Several years after escaping Korea, Shin sat down with reporter Blaine Harden to share his heart-wrenching story. The journalist went on to write an account of Shin's awe-inspiring story and his desire to escape hell on earth in a book titled Camp 14, One Man's Remarkable Odyssey from North Korea to Freedom in the West. Shin detailed his early life in Camp 14, shedding light on the unimaginable struggles he faced each day. It was both a brutal and terrifying existence, and all that mattered was survival. Daily beatings, starvation, and snitching on other prisoners were a way of life for the young man. Emotions were absent, and the thought of love and family held no meaning in such a world. All Shin saw when he looked into the eyes of his mother and brother was competition for food. Each day, they were served a thick gruel of oats and cabbage containing little or no sustenance. This forced Shin and other inmates to catch and eat rodents, frogs, and snakes in an attempt to sustain themselves. When questioned about education and his upbringing inside the prisons, Shin claims he knew little to nothing about the outside world. He had never heard of the United States, nor did he even know what shape the world was. The brutal conditions of the prison left people like Shin mentally traumatized. He assumed the outside world was precisely the same as the camp, so he never even thought about escaping in his younger years. Conditioned by the beatings and trauma suffered within the dark facility, he explains that those who tried to escape were caught and then executed in front of the other prisoners as a warning. The actual scope of his trauma can be witnessed in his decision to turn on his brother and mother, who were planning to escape the facility. After hearing of their plan, Shin's heart began to pound frantically as he knew that if his family were involved in an escape in any way, he would later be beaten, tortured, or even killed. So, immediately, he ran to one of the guards and turned them in. Despite his decision to turn on his family, Shin was arrested the next day and tortured for 7 months in an underground prison. Speaking on Shin's decision to betray his own family, Harden writes, he had heard his brother and his mother talk about a planned escape. His training was such that when he heard the word escape, he became completely alarmed. His heart started to pound. He felt that if his family was involved in an escape in any way, that he would be either beaten, tortured, or killed. So, immediately when he heard this, he turned them in. He was then arrested the next day and tortured for 7 months in an underground prison. The testimonies of Shin and other people who escaped the horrific conditions of the camp have worked to help shed light on the appalling conditions within these dark places. Unfortunately, they also have given us first-hand knowledge of the crimes against humanity that are committed far away from the eyes of society. But that doesn't mean secrets of life within the walls of concentration camps like Kaishan don't reach the outside world. In fact, we've even heard terrifying stories about several punishments prisoners may face. Going back to the story of Shin, during his time in the camp, he worked in a sewing machine factory shortly before his daring escape. On one occasion, he accidentally dropped an expensive piece of equipment, which sent the guards into a frenzy. They removed Shin from his position and tortured him over a coal fire. According to Blaine, this terrifying experience is backed up by the scars found all across the body of the former prisoner. When they were finished burning his body, they took it one step further and cut off a portion of his finger. All this simply because he made a minor mistake. These punishments were minor compared to those reserved for anyone who tried to escape the camp. For anyone caught trying to escape the horrendous conditions of the Gulag, it would result in an instant death sentence, either by hanging or being shot to death. Unfortunately, Shin had to experience both of the latter during his time in the camp as he watched as the heartless soldiers dragged his mother into an open area in front of all the prisoners before she was publicly hanged, whereas his brother was executed by gunfire in front of him. One can't even imagine the trauma associated with going through such an experience. But to the prisoners with broken spirits, such horrendous crimes against humanity were just a facet of everyday life within Camp 14. Looking back at Shin's story, it's difficult to imagine such an experience from the standpoint of our lives in Western culture. To be born into a prison and know nothing of the outside world, to spend each and every day fighting for survival against those who brought you into the world, appears to be taken straight from a dystopian novel. Yet, this life exists for tens of thousands of people in North Korea. If you were horrified by the conditions found within Camp 14, it is but one of many prisons of a similar terrifying nature. Others known to exist include the Yodok political prison camp known as Camp 15, the Hwasong political prison camp, often referred to as Camp 16, and the Pukchang political prison camp dubbed Camp 18. Many who have listened to the stories of survivors and former prisoners can't help but compare the facilities to those the Nazis used to imprison Jews during the Second World War. Those like Shin, who managed to break free of their chains and defect to South Korea, often have difficulty integrating into their new society. Journalists and human rights activists are hopeful their stories can motivate the international community to speak out about the crimes against humanity taking place in North Korea. Yet, as the communist government continues to dismiss the claims of any prison camps spoken about in this video, it appears the future is dark, bleak, and full of suffering for the tens of thousands of North Koreans locked away from the outside world.